Intel are back, and so are ASUS. This is the brand new Zenbook S14, and this is a big one. Not literally, it's actually a very small 14-inch laptop, and we'll talk about the design and everything else in a second, but the reason why this is a big deal, and actually a bit of a special video, this is the first laptop out of the gate, or at least the first one that I've tested, with one of these. The brand new Intel Core Ultra Series 2 chip. So this is like the update to Meteor Lake that we had at the beginning of this year. Now we're on Lunar Lake, that was the code name, but for everyone going into stores or buying one of these new laptops, you will see it as the Intel Core Ultra Series 2. And Intel is making some big claims about performance, about AI, and also crucially battery life. So I'm putting this up against rivals from AMD, Qualcomm, and also the previous generation Intel chips to see if this really is as good as we're all hoping it is. So a big thank you to ASUS for setting this out for me to test, and I'm going to show you a ton of my own results benchmarking this later in the video, and the results are actually very surprising. But also, full disclosure, this video is made in partnership with ASUS. No input on script, no input on the tests I run, and no input on the competing devices I'm using. Bottom line, all my results are my own. But before we dive into performance and battery tests, let me give you a bit of context, because about a month or so ago I reviewed the Zenbook S16, the bigger brother to this Zenbook S14, which was available in both Intel and AMD configurations, although the one I tested was the AMD. However, this S14 is all in on Intel. It's only coming with the new Core Ultra Series 2 processors. Well, I say processors, I should really say system on a chip, because it's more than just the CPU. You've got the integrated graphics, the second generation Intel Xe2 Arc graphics. We've got the NPU, a much more powerful neural engine. And we've also got the memory actually on the chip now. So that does mean you can't upgrade it yourself. You either get 16 or 32 gigs, but it's much more responsive, much more efficient, and we'll dive into that stuff in a second. So you've got the CPU, the GPU, the NPU, the memory, all the media encoder stuff. There is a lot on this little chip, and it's probably the most radical redesign of Intel's mobile architecture in years. And with these new chips in these new laptops, it is all about efficiency. It's about maintaining performance while also boosting your battery life, because these are designed for these kind of premium thinner light laptops and hopefully, finally, give some proper competition to the MacBooks. So right now with these new processors, there are 9 different versions in Ultra 5, Ultra 7, and Ultra 9 SKUs. I've got the top dog here, the 288V, along with the 140V integrated graphics, and this Ultra 9 has a 28 watt TDP, which is significantly lower than last year's Ultra 9, which was around 45 watts, but also appreciably higher than the 17 watts that you'll get on an Ultra 7. However, on the face of it, it doesn't all appear to be good news, because Intel's actually dropped the number of cores down to 8 cores from 16. They've halved the number of cores, and they've removed hyperthreading. So on this Ultra 9 288V, which is the top-end chip, it is an 8-core, 8-thread processor, which compared to AMD's 12-core, or as I say, even Intel's previous 16-core chips, it's fair to say this new architecture needs to be pretty incredible to actually make up for that drop in core count. Then there's the faster integrated graphics, the Xe2, as well as a much beefier NPU, the neural processing unit with 48 TOPS of AI compute power, meaning this does meet Microsoft's spec for a Copilot Plus AI PC, so you'll get co-creator and live translations, and when they eventually release it, recall. But before we nerd out about the benchmarks, first we need to talk about Ceraluminum. Ceraluminum? Ceraluminum? Ceramic, aluminium, Ceraluminum. I bet their marketing team over at ASUS are very happy with that one. It's ASUS's new lightweight, high-tech material for the chassis of the S14, and it comes in either Scandinavian white or this Zumaya grey. I mean, it looks and feels like aluminium, which is great and very, very lightweight, but it also has this sort of extra hardness, toughness because of this ceramic process material. I don't know how it all works, but anyway, it's very nice looking. It doesn't pick up any fingerprints, barely any screen wobble. It can go that far back. Would have been nice if it could go flat, but there we are. Very comfortable backlit keyboard, huge touchpad. They could not squeeze a bigger one in there, which is really nice and responsive, and also has gesture support. So if you scroll your finger up and down the left side, it changes the volume. On the right side is the brightness. It's actually quite a nice shortcut rather than having to find the F key, and you can customize what this does or even turn it off if you prefer. Plus we have dual mics for AI noise cancellation and also quad Harman Kardon tuned Dolby Atmos speakers. And as for ports, we get ultra-fast USB-Cs with Thunderbolt 4, a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A, an HDMI 2.1, and an audio combo jack. And obviously we get Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.4 as well. Very nice. And just look how thin these bezels are. It's pretty nuts, actually. And they've squeezed in a 1080p webcam up there with Windows Face Lock support. As for the quality, well, you be the judge. This is the 1080p webcam up here. I've got my studio lighting there, but if I spin around, give you, well, a little bit of a tour of what I'm looking at behind the scenes there. So this also supports face unlocking, Windows face unlocking, and it's got a 3D IR sensor, so it works well in low light. We've got 3D noise reduction as well, and because it's a Copilot Plus PC, I can turn on all the fancy Windows Studio effects like auto framing, eye contact, so I can actually look at the screen, but then it juts my eyes up to make it like I'm looking at you. Also background effects, and all this is run on the MPU, so actually it uses a lot less battery life than it would on other laptops using these kind of features running on the GPU or the CPUs. And this S14 weighs just 1.2 kilograms, and it's slightly lighter and a touch thinner than a MacBook Air 13, despite this having a bigger screen. In fact, if I pop that there, let me show you the difference between the 14 and the 16. Here's what I made earlier. This is the AMD powered Zenbook S16. This is the new Intel powered Zenbook 14. And except for the chip inside and also the different color, we've got the Zemaya Grey and the Scandinavian White, and also the screen size, they are brothers, essentially. Although I'm curious, if you were going to pick one of these up, would you go for the 14 or the 16, and also which color would you go for? Let me know in the comments below. My only complaint, and we need to have a serious talk about this, is whoever puts the stickers on these laptops. But look how wonky that HDMI sticker is. I'll tell you what though, this ASUS Lunar OLED 16x10 3K 120Hz touchscreen more than makes up for a wonky sticker. Brightness tops out at 400 nits in SDR or 500 nits in peak HDR, which is good, although not class leading. Plus we get Dolby Vision support, and because it's OLED and because it hits the 500 nits, this meets the Display HDR 500 True Black spec. In my tests, this hit 100% of the sRGB and the P3 color gamuts, so I would be more than happy to use this for editing my photos and videos, for everyday office tasks, and maybe even playing a couple of games. Now specs-wise, this test sample I've got from ASUS has the top-end Ultra 9 288V with 32GB of integrated LPDDR5X RAM. We've also got 1TB of storage and a 72 watt-hour battery with a 65 watt power adapter. I think you can probably tell I really like this laptop, but it's all going to come down to how fast is it, how long does it last, and also how much is it? Well, let's talk about battery life, and I put this up against last-gen Intel chips and most of its main competition right now in a full-screen YouTube streaming test running at 200 nits of brightness in their most power-efficient settings. And unsurprisingly, it was the previous first-gen Intel Core Ultra 9 that conked out first after 8 hours and 11 minutes. Then we had the AMD-powered Zenbook S16, which went on to 9 hours 44. The screen is bigger, but then so is the battery, but this is all just to give you a rough idea. And then the MacBook Air 13 with the M3 chip dropped out at 10 hours and 39 minutes, making it a 2-horse race. And then after a frankly amazing 13 hours, 23 minutes, it was the new Zenbook S14's turn, followed by the Microsoft Surface Laptop 7th edition with its Snapdragon X Elite at a very impressive 14 hours 41. So the Snapdragon still won in that battery test, but this represents a 64% increase in battery life over the previous gen Intel chips. But it gets even better. Switching over to PC Mark 10, the new Zenbook S14 lost 2% of its battery during the benchmark versus 9% lost with the first gen Core Ultra. And when I left this for 15 hours overnight for a bit of a standby test, it was still on 100% when I woke up the next day. Okay, so it's not entirely surprising that a processor with half the number of cores, without hyper-threading, and also a lower relative TDP lasts longer than the older model. But how does that translate to performance? Are we giving up some power in favor of efficiency and battery? Well, in my Geekbench 6 test, this new top-end chip beats out its predecessor in single core by 7% and matches or gets close to its rivals. However, multi-core is a different story. That drop down to 8 cores has definitely had an effect here. In Cinebench, single core was up 18% gen on gen and beat everything except the Apple M3. Great. Downside, multi-core was down nearly a third. And it was a similar story in my Blender render test. Going back to PC Mark 10, which is more of an everyday productivity-based test, these new Intel chips actually matched the last gen performance, which actually is impressive given this has a much longer battery life. So it's kind of like Intel has reprioritized what we'd want out of a thin and light laptop like this. And so I think higher single core performance and much longer battery life makes sense in exchange for lower multi-core performance. But what do you think? And it is also worth remembering, compared to its Snapdragon rivals, that being x86, this has no app compatibility issues. This will run everything. But what about graphics? Well, in my 3D Mark benchmark suite, the Arc 140V was around 17% faster than last gen Intel in Wildlife Extreme, 11% faster in Time Spy, and 8% faster in Steel Nomad Lite. And while I don't know how many people are necessarily playing games on these kind of laptops, the uptick in gaming performance was a lot more significant. And in my tests, I was aiming for 1080p medium settings with XeSS turned on, that's Intel's AI upscaling, where supported. And Cyberpunk ran a third faster on the new chip, averaging 52 FPS, which is by far the highest frame rate of any machine on test here, and it's kind of hard to believe this is running on integrated graphics. Spider-Man Remastered is 23% faster than last gen, again by far the highest of any of the alternatives, and it was the same in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which felt like I was actually playing on a discrete GPU. Siege was 21% faster as well, easily beating out the others. One thing that is clear though is that the Snapdragon X Elite counterparts, while impressive in single core, multi-core, and battery life, definitely fall behind in gaming with the Adreno graphics, and also of course, as I mentioned, have some app compatibility issues because they're based on an ARM rather than x86 architecture. But what about performance on battery? Well, my results were pretty similar using performance and full speed modes, though I've seen some of Intel's own numbers where this can drop anywhere from a couple of percent to more than a third when using the more balanced speed profiles. And wouldn't you know it, just as I was finishing this video, watch it turn up, but an identical Zenbook, but this one with a Core Ultra 7 instead of the Ultra 9. So while I'll dig into the differences more in my upcoming roundup video, I ran a couple of quick tests just to give you an idea of the difference. And again, in full speed mode, the Core Ultra 9 was about 2% faster in Geekbench 6's single core, around 2.5% in multi-core, and just 1% faster in PC Mark 10. Nothing to really write home about then. Perhaps the Ultra 7 is the sweet spot. And I actually got a couple of FPS more in Cyberpunk. So I think more testing needs to be done, but so far the differences with the Ultra 9 don't seem particularly significant. So we've talked about CPU, we've talked about GPU, then of course we've got the NPU, which is apparently 4 times faster than the previous gen. Now, AI is all a bit fluffy. Yes, we have some co-creator tools, but I don't really use them every day. I think live translation is actually the most useful. And of course, we are going to have recall. I'm sure we'll get more over time. And there are a handful of programs and apps that have in some way utilized for the NPU, like auto masking in DaVinci Resolve. There's some audio apps, but most of the time you're not really taking advantage of the NPU. It's much more about future-proofing. Over time, as developers optimize their programs, more tasks will be offloaded from the CPU and the GPU onto the NPU, and then either doing it faster or more efficiently, so you save more batteries. You should be absolutely fine with this as more AI features come out. But one other advantage of having this more efficient, lower TDP chip is it runs cooler and it runs more quietly. The S14 stays considerably cooler and also a little bit quieter than older Intel laptops I've tested, even after an hour of gaming. And while you can hear the fans if you're pushing it in games, they're still pretty quiet. And most of the time when you're using this laptop, you don't hear a thing. And it's not just the more efficient chip. We've also got this cooling grill here, which I believe actually is 2,715 drilled vents, drilled grill, along with a dual fan vapor chamber cooling system in here. So the actual hardware that ASUS have built around the new chip also does a really good job keeping it running cool and quiet. Internally, in my tests, the CPU tops out at around 92 Celsius in more graphics-heavy tasks and games, and around the mid-80s in CPU-focused apps. A lot better than the previous gen, which I would often see around the 100°C mark. And that is the new ASUS Zenbook S14. What do you think? In terms of being the first Intel Core Ultra Series 2 processor, I hate that name, I wouldn't say the new chip is like a complete knockout of the park home run and everything else is absolute garbage compared to this, but it does make Intel competitive again. I think it really does take away a lot of the USPs from going over for a Snapdragon chip unless you can get a much more affordable laptop. These new chips are likely to be in more premium thinner light laptops, sort of, over £1,000, maybe sort of 1,500-ish. So this is quite expensive, and it is just this form factor, but certainly no app compatibility issues, fantastic battery life, not far behind at all the Snapdragon rivals, more AI tops than you could shake a stick at, fantastic integrated GPU performance, and decently faster single core, albeit with that trade-off of lower multi-core performance. But I think that is the right reprioritization of performance and battery and efficiency for a laptop like this. As for the pricing, well, it will vary based on region, currency, and also obviously the model you go for, but I will put confirmed final pricing in the description below and also pin a comment, and also leave a link if you fancy checking this out for yourself. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, a cheeky little like and subscribe would be fantastic, and I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.